Well, welcome everyone to the first episode of Maker Explorer. I'm Retro, a contributor from the Sustainable Ecosystem Scaling Core Unit, and I'm also joined by Juan, our facilitator. Today is the first episode of Maker Explorer, where we'll be exploring, for lack of a better term, topics throughout the Maker ecosystem. And today we're focused on real-world assets. We're joined by Luca, the team project lead from Project RealWorld Sandbox, to present his grant report from the past several weeks of effort. From here, I'll hand it over to Luca.
Thanks, Retro. Can I ask everybody to go on mute? Awesome. So I think this is the third presentation we had on the topic. So apologize to those that joined previous presentations if we are repeating something. But the ambition of this presentation was to be more detailed and more comprehensive in what we have been doing in the last few weeks. So we started 5 weeks ago an effort backed by SES to, let's say, turbocharge the initiatives we had in the space of real-world financing. And we call the project RealWorld Sandbox. The project itself had 5 objectives. We had was, first of all, obviously increasing the activity we have in onboarding collateral from the so-called real world. Do this in a sustainable way. So do this in a way that will not provide us nasty surprises down the line when the activities scale. At the same time, continuing stimulating a healthy culture of checks and balances and distribution of roles of responsibility across the DAO and not necessarily within one core unit. We had 2 objectives in the project. The first one was understanding what we wanted to do, i.e., what types of credit we want to finance, and the second one, how we wanted to do it. So how we wanted to relate with external counterparties and organize ourselves internally to do that. In order to do that, we started by studying and trying to understand the lending stack, how we call it. And everything I'm saying here, you will be able to read it in the report that will be published later today, which is much more comprehensive, as you can expect. But on the left-hand side, for the sake of the discussion, we put here a very high-level overview of how the lending stack works. So when you go to a bank as a borrower, you don't know this because everything is integrated behind the curtains of the bank. So you're a borrower, you ask for a loan, the bank underwrites the loan, i.e. tries to understand what is the risk you're having and what type of interest rate they should charge you. And they retain this loan in their books and wait for you to repay. If you don't repay, they might do some actions in order to force you to repay, or maybe take over the collateral in case there is a collateral, for example, in the case of a mortgage, a house. Now, this set of activities can actually be split into several elementary activities. And when you go into the institutional wholesale lending space, those activities are often conducted by different actors. So you have a borrower. The borrower is interfacing itself with an originator. The originator is the person or the platform that actually deals with the relationship. The originator sometimes underwrites the loan, i.e. tries to understand if you're a good risk or a bad risk and how much you should pay in terms of interest rate. Somebody else sometimes structures this loan and sends it to investors. And investors can be of different kinds. So the same loan can actually be tranched into different liens. A first loss tranche, which is higher risk, but also gets higher return, a senior tranche, or a men's tranche, a super senior tranche, and so forth and so forth. And in parallel, there are a set of servicers, so companies that don't necessarily take any risk, but help the whole structure to work smoothly. So the first question that we wanted to ask ourselves was, what type of lender should Maker be? Should Maker be an integrated lending, i.e. like a bank, like you go to Maker and Maker does everything behind the scene, or should Maker be a bit more of a passive lender that leaves the rest of the ecosystem to organize itself in order to access Maker as a source of financing. And let me just go. Okay, so these were the two things we wanted to ask. As I said before, what type of credit Maker should finance, should interface itself with, and how should Maker structure itself to do this appropriately over the lifespan of the loan. So if we go to pillar one, so what type of credit should Maker finance? We had a few questions we wanted to answer. We tried to answer in the report. So first of all, do we understand exactly how the lending stack works in TradFi, which is slightly different from the way it works in DeFi? How clear it is the positioning we think Maker should have? Do we have a clear set of so-called eligibility criteria, i.e., set of characteristics that the credit should have if we can finance it, very clear in our mind? And do we have a framework that describes what type of counterparties we can interact with? So the first point, so we tried to answer. We gave an answer to those questions, preliminary answer to those questions in the report up for discussion. But I think these answers are very important because they set the scene for what we think should be the activity of Maker for the next years. The first one is, and I'll stop guys for question after this, but the first one is, we think Maker should be the ultimate lender of the stack. What does it mean? We think Maker should be much more similar to what a central bank is rather than an investment bank. So a central bank gives financing to banks, but it's very conservative. So they will accept as collateral pledge only the most resilient types of collateral that you can pledge, you can repo to the central bank. They will give financing almost for free, or actually for free nowadays to banks, but only because that collateral is super safe and is structured in a super safe way. We think Maker should be much closer to this than an investment bank that actually looks for maximizing their profit. That's why. Why? Because we think this is much more consistent with the underlying ambition of Maker of expanding the footprint of the DAI in a very sustainable way, protecting the peg. How does this translate into reality? There's several types of credits out there. Some credits are better than others for this mission. It doesn't mean that we should only do this type of credits, but it means that it's easier to do this type of credits. And these are credits that are very standardized, are regulated, they have short duration, good turnover, good liquidity in the secondary market if something goes well. We have identified certain underlying credits that have these characteristics: corporate loans, short-term corporate loans, consumer loans in regulated markets, loans that are intermediated by banks, for example, like the closer to the SOGEN MIP6. But again, these are not necessarily the only credit types we would do. But these are credit types that are very attractive, and other credit types should mimic the same characteristics through structuring. And the third point was about counterparties. What type of counterparties we should work with? We identified a set of characteristics we should score counterparties against, and then we identified a set of structures that are actually compatible with what we want to do. And in the presentation, you can see a long list of the characteristics of the credit types we score the credit types against. Again, I'm not going to go through these in detail because these are in the report. And a set of characteristics that we score the counterparties against. So is the counterparty has a good history, track record? Do they have skin in the game? Are they regulated? Where do they operate? How big they are? How good they are in providing data, etc., etc. The ultimate conclusion of this is a set of eligibility criteria that we think Maker should have very clear and maintain when dealing with counterparties. So a very clear set of requirements that are public and should also guide counterparties that want to get financed by Maker. So I think this is the most powerful tool, a tool that if we are credible enough, it's self-fulfilling because the counterparties that want to access the space will know that if they are not within this scope, they hopefully will not be accepted by Maker token holders. But we will talk about the process later. I will stop here because I think I hope that you guys have questions about what I've said so far.
Again, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we'll ask you to unmute.
So I think if nobody has questions, I just wanted to stress again the importance of what we have said so far and the fact that you will have a lot of time to discuss this, because we will publish a report later today in the forum threads, and this report will open de facto a consultation phase where everybody can chip in and provide their feedback. This report has been already discussed with a few people out there and a few people that are also in the call, and you will see the names on the front page of the report. But these are token holders, people like that are fundamental in the community, like Rune himself, potential counterparties of people that have been discussing and interacting with Maker. Like Matt from Success, or the guys at Centrifuge, or Jason Jones, etc. So I think you will see a lot of those names in the report, as well as people that are active in the core units, like our friends from SES or from the RealWorld Financing core unit. And the important thing that I want to stress here again is we think this is a big shift, because if not looking for returns, but looking for structured and super safe types of credit, it is laborious at the beginning, because there will be a lot of education to do and a lot of opportunities to do business that we will just give up, but will make the conversation much more institutional. Meaning that we think that fast forward a few months or a year or two, big credible regulated institutions like regulated banks or international organizations or international asset managers will see in Maker one of the most powerful partners to get very cheap source of financing. And I think this will be super powerful if we want to make RealWorld financing not a 100 million activity within Maker, but a 10 billion activity with Maker in a few years' time.
Got it. I believe that there were 2 questions submitted. The first one was by Eric. Eric, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, hi, it's Eric. Luca, how you doing? This looks really interesting. Can we give us a sense of what's kind of the minimum credit standard? I mean, are you thinking triple B or better, basically, for anything that Maker is going to finance?
So I think there is actually table in the report that does the comparison of the probability of default that we had in mind with the ratings. And you're right. So what we have in mind are credit types that have a probability of default over 1 year below or around 1%, and this translates to investment grade, so triple B type of credit.
Thank you.
When we did this, what we tried to do was to mimic what central banks are trying to onboard, because I think we shouldn't be too far from that type of risk, and we have a similar cost of capital. So I think we shouldn't be too far from that type of risk. Obviously, we can be less restrictive because like we need to work with counterparties that are not necessarily so standardized. Otherwise, they wouldn't be courageous enough to try to access DeFi. But I think these are the guidelines that we're trying to keep.
Got it. And I believe Peyton also had another question submitted in the chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So my question is kind of centering around who is determining this eligibility criteria. Like, I imagine some of these things essentially like there might be disagreement in the community whether a point is met or not. So kind of A, who's determining it, and B, when decisions are made in terms of eligibility, how is that communicated to the community?
Thanks, Peyton. I think that's a great question, and it is a great timing, because this is what the second part of the presentation talks about. So I think in the first part of the presentation, we wanted to communicate our view as a working group, or what we think should be the direction for Maker. And I think this is a very important philosophical point, because it puts sustainability and expansion ahead of profit maximization. And I think in transparency ahead of profit maximization, which is a very important point that not necessarily everybody agrees with, but that's why we wanted to float the idea with you guys and open a consultation phase. The second part of the presentation is about process. So how we thought could be a process structured within Maker to deal with all those decision points and collaborate with the counterparties. So if there are not other questions, I can go to the process, but I'll stop here for a sec if somebody else has questions about the type of credit.
Yeah, I believe Sebastian submitted a question as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. What would you do with the current MIP6 and approved and live real-world asset, excluding SocGen that is a bit different, as that would not be investment grade from credit rating agencies, and that implicit probability of default above 1%, as most have stability fee above 2%.
Thanks, Ab. I think I don't have an answer, because I think what we have in mind doesn't have any official backing from governance at all. And I think at the end, and we will go through the process later, and I hope we will answer those questions. I think at the end, there is no delegation of power we are expecting, and the power of decision stays with MKR holders. But let's assume, for example, that we decide as a community to go forward and implement our vision of process and eligibility criteria, and there is a set of, like a core unit or a set of core units that is incubated with a mandate. And these core units that they don't necessarily agree with the type of credit and the type of application that has been already submitted, those core units would probably provide their own view, which is obviously not committal, but then it will be the Maker MPR token holders that will decide whether they want to proceed with the approval or not. Now, hopefully, our ambition would be to have a coherent perspective by all the real world finance core units involved, and that will give us a single message, a coherent message to the community. But obviously, we cannot foresee this to happen every time. So I think the short answer is I don't know, but the better version of that answer is that at the end it will be the MKR token holders that will take the ultimate decisions.
But just as a follow-up, from your perspective and from your report, you don't think we should invest in those kind of investment? And that's what you present to the community to kind of approve.
Yeah, I think as a follow-up, we will need to try and make every application compliant with this type of risk. You can reduce risk through a set of mechanisms. So you can transform a risk that has a probability of default of 2-3% to a risk that has a probability of default of 1%. Sometimes it is, for example, an inclusion of another tranche. It is a different structure. It is different haircut on the collaterals. Is a different set of guarantees, etc. But I think the reason why we're doing this, it is because, and I stress this in the report, there is a fundamental difference between the world of smart contracts and the world of traditional credit for Maker. In the world of smart contracts, liquidations are not great, but liquidations can be managed in a very systematic way, and most of the times are actually source of profit for the protocol. In the world of TradFi, especially with the bridge that we are creating now, my view is that liquidation events should be black swans. It doesn't mean that we don't know what to do when they happen, because obviously we need to be ready, but they should never happen. Because one thing is a default that requires a restructuring, but a liquidation event is cumbersome, complicated, costly, and untested. That's why I think we should position ourselves to have those events as black swans, i.e. leaving returns on the table, but protecting ourselves. Again, this is my personal view, is not the community's view, but I think we should try to do this. We should try to enforce this as much as possible.
Excellent. We'll take exit. Eric, I believe, had one more question.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. One question. So most of the assets considered here are not standalone investment grade. You know, if I have one single home mortgage or one small business loan. And so they're going to need to be structured typically in a pool with a bunch of them, and then with a decent sized tranche of sub debt or equity underneath them. Any thoughts on where this other capitals would come from? Because this is not an insignificant portion of capital.
Thanks, Eric. I agree. I think we put some examples in the report of potential structures, but I think there are many. For the benefit of the community, we might see intermediaries coming with a bond structure with some additional collateral pledge, like the case of core bonds, or SPV structures where we have bankruptcy remote vehicles where Maker would provide liquidity in exchange for a credit-linked note, or some type of loan, or a revolving facility to a trust structures, etc., etc. Now, I think your point is very important. I think the answer should come from intermediaries, because I think what we need to do here as Maker community members is educate the community out there that there is a super powerful and cheap pool of capital that can be accessed to finance certain types of credit. Yeah. If we reach the right counterparties with this message, they will organize themselves and raise capital and consider Maker as an additional pool of capital that can access to reduce their cost of capital for the whole structure. But I think this, hopefully, the education phase will be painful at the beginning, because there will be a lot of talking, a lot of writing. But I think once the message has been passed through a set of hopefully successful MIP6s, I think the message is very powerful.
Thanks. That's very helpful. I mean, as those of us on the real world finance team talk to potential counterparties, having a very clear box of what we do, I think will go a long way, and then let the market create things that work for our box.
Yeah, and I always stress, and I wrote this in one of the last pages of this presentation, that the way we saw this report, it's not like us in civil code. Like we were not aiming at producing a 200 pages super comprehensive report that is very difficult in being applied. We wanted this report hopefully to work as a set of constitutional principles in a common law system. What I mean is the precedents, i.e. the MIP6 applications that will be rejected and approved, will act as the most powerful guideline for future applications. So these are a set of principles that I agree with you will be very powerful if they are published to the outside world. But then the most powerful precedents to understand how things should be done are the MIP6s themselves, right? So if you reject or approve a MIP6, this sends a massively powerful message to the community of what they can do, what they must do if they want to access the financing window or not. Should I move, guys, to the next section, which I think is quite important?
Yeah, I don't believe there are any other questions.
Okay, so the second part of the report actually deals with the process. So we wanted to ask ourselves how we can structure ourselves internally and vis-a-vis the counterparties to originate and monitor real-world collaterals appropriately. So first of all, we wanted to make sure that we incentivize a culture of healthy decentralization, meaning without replicating too many roles and just sharing responsibilities across the DAO. This in order to avoid also single points of failure. As we know well, in a decentralized community, social capital and trusts go a long way, but they naturally tend to integrate and within certain groups a lot of responsibilities because people want to get things done and the community trusts them. But we want to make sure that this is counterbalanced by a culture that tries to avoid single points of failure as much as possible. And then we wanted to draft a process that would allow this initiative to be as scalable and as safe as possible. So the way we thought about it, and here I just wanted to give, again, a very simplified description of how the credit stream will work. We will have a borrower. The borrower sometimes goes to the originator. The originator puts assets in a bankruptcy remote asset pool of some sort. There is an issuing agent that helps this asset pool to be tranched and structured. Sometimes there is an arranger. You might recall Rune's post on the arranger model that helps a lot of other service providers gather around this business proposal, and this business proposal goes to maker. Now, sometimes this whole stream could be integrated in one single agent, like in the case of Sogen, for example, that came forward with like a fully comprehensive MIP6 that might be satisfactory or not, but they're coming with the package ready. Or sometimes there might be an arranger that puts everything together, all the pieces together. They know maker, and they just come forward and they present the application to maker. And I think maker should be agnostic. I think maker should value all the different setups in the same way, just trying to protect the core principles that are outlined in the vision. But then, there is not a structure better than the other. Like, structures are all different. I mean, in my view, in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, we might see standardized structures emerge, but this is not necessarily the case today. But once the MIP6 is submitted, I think the most important part starts, and that's what we tried to design in the report. So we thought about an onboarding process that is multi-tiered. What does it mean? Let's say that a MIP6 is submitted, and we might have a set of one or more, we call portfolio core units, that interact with the counterparty to analyze the MIP6. Why we have more than one core unit? Because we thought the core units should be very specialized in certain types of risks. The same person who knows how to underwrite prime real estate in California has no clue on the risk of consumer credit in Nigeria, or of bank-backed covered bonds in Europe. So we thought of a set of portfolio core units that are very specialized and very nimble and very small on certain types of risks. But those core units will be the one that just come forward, discuss with the counterparty, analyze the proposal based on the core principles. They might be hopefully backed by a legal support core unit. These are not internal lawyers, but these will be the legal counsel of makers. So the person who knows legalese, who knows how to interact with external counsel or external legal counterparties, in the same way that it happens in a bank or in a fund. The internal legal team doesn't take any legal risk, but knows is the right person who speaks the right jargon. Now, this level interacts directly with the counterparty, analyzes the application, and comes forward with a view. The view is not obviously approval or rejection, because the power stays at the level of token holders, but is a qualified opinion on whether the term sheet that has been discussed and has been negotiated is satisfactory or not for maker. Then you see a second level that we call the compliance core unit. The compliance core unit is the controller of the controllers. Let's put it like that. The compliance core unit doesn't interact with the counterparties, but they will provide a qualified opinion on whether the process the portfolio core unit has followed is compliant with the view of maker. So it doesn't matter, they are completely agnostic on the underlying collateral and counterparty, but they are not agnostic on the process. So if the core unit that is focused on California prime real estate is the one that is providing a view on solar in Nigeria, the compliance core unit would probably say that the skills of the portfolio core unit are not satisfactory. If the type of credit risk that has been considered as compliant by the portfolio core unit underneath is not 1%, but it's 2, 3, 4, 5%, or is structured in a different way, the compliance core unit will probably say that this level of credit risk is not satisfactory based on the eligibility criteria that have been voted by the community. So it is a second level, second set of eyes that makes sure that everything is compliant, and also will be particularly important, in my view, when we scale this thing up. And we will not have one portfolio core unit, but we will have 5, 10, 15 portfolio core units. And the more we go forward, the more the activity inside Maker will be standardized and stuff will be pushed out of the Maker DAO, and the more important the core unit will be. In my view, fast forward, who knows how many years, DeFi goes very fast, the compliance core unit will be the only one remaining within the DAO, and the rest will be pushed out. But the compliance core unit will be very standardized, very parametrical, and very bureaucratic, let's say, in order to see whether all the boxes have been ticked. Now, the compliance core unit will still publish an opinion, but ultimately the power to accept or reject a proposal is still in the hands of the token holder. So there is no mandate, there is no delegation of power. Now, the delegation of power, going back, this is a bit more of a detailed but very important point. The delegation of power, going back to Eric's point, might be within certain boundaries. But I'll make this example later to make not to confuse yourself, guys. But in the following page, we drafted at high level how we thought this would work. So the counterparty submits the MIP6. The MIP6 is reviewed by the core unit. If the core unit doesn't feel this MIP6 as it is satisfactory, hopefully it renegotiates with the counterparty until it is satisfactory. And then we'll publish a term sheet that goes alongside the MIP6, and the compliance will review this MIP6 and the term sheet and publish an opinion whether this is compliant or not. If it's not compliant, it goes back to the portfolio core unit. If it is compliant, publishes also a compliance certificate. And now with the MIP6, the term sheet, and the compliance certificate, the community has all the elements to take a decision. If the community rejects an application, this doesn't mean that the same counterparty can come back with the same application later on. But at least there will be 2 layers of control for the community that are hopefully independent on the application itself and the process that has been used. The point I wanted to make, I don't have a slide for this, but the point I wanted to make, and then I stop for a second, is what I was saying before about delegation of power within certain boundaries. As Eric was saying, in the real world, you will not see a counterparty coming with each mortgage or each individual financing to ask for MIP6. It would be impossible. There is some type of pre-approval required. And this always happens in the credit market. What we call it in the credit market is forward flow approval. So a counterparty comes and say, I have this view, I want to provide you credit within certain characteristics that are very parametrical. Would you give me a line? And the lender would say, yes, I give you a line subject to certain requirements and up to $10 million, $20 million, $1 billion. The counterparty doesn't need to come back and ask for approval for every single credit that enters this bucket, enters this forward flow, if it stays within the boundaries. The only thing they need to do is provide transparency about what they're doing. Because if what they're doing is outside the mandate, then the lender needs to have the power, the lender of some sort needs to have the power to stop the flow or liquidate what's on, liquidate what is not compliant, or to do take some action. Now, this is very, very important because I think the type of credit that we would like to see in Maker, which is short-lived and very standardized with a high churn and very liquid, will naturally just be financed and refinanced and repaid all the time. So I think having a clear mandate for the forward flow of credit, it might take a long time to negotiate, will empower the counterparties to go out there in the market and know that they have a certainty of a financing line with Maker, and they can go out and raise funds, and provide funds to ultimate borrowers. Maker at the same time needs to keep visibility and the power to delegate it or not to a trust authority or within Maker. It depends on the structure, to stop what is not compliant and to enforce the principles that have been discussed in the mandate with the counterparty. And I think this is a very important distinction that we need to make when we onboard some credit, because some comes ready as it is as a bond, and others come as a mandate, as an intention of doing stuff in the future. So I think this goes. I think Peyton, hopefully this answer somehow your question. And the last point, and I think might be useful to answer your question, is these principles. Actually, there is another point that is very important. These principles of good governance that we have discussed here, in our view, would have to be. Sorry, let me go back here. So this principle that we have discussed would, in my view, they need to be voted on chain, meaning that there needs to be a very strong mandate for these principles by the community. How this would work, in my view, but again, I'm just putting the idea on the table, and hopefully somebody will disagree and propose a better idea. I think there is one element missing here in this framework, and it is the existence of the compliance core unit. We have real world finance core units that interact with the counterparties already. We have one, we might have more in the future, but there is not a compliance core unit that is ensuring that this type of process and level of institutionalization is maintained. If the compliance core unit will be incubated, will ask for a mandate. Within that mandate, we should encapsulate these core principles that we have discussed here in short form. I think this will give a very strong mandate to the compliance core unit that they can go out and do their job, and the community agrees with the principles. Those principles can be amended, updated, changed, scrapped in any way, but I think those principles need to be set in stone with some form of on-chain institutional governance mechanism.
Sounds like now is a good time to pause for questions. Will was the first one to propose one in the chat. If you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, so I just had a question. You talked about the first line of actually oversight, which is essentially the what you mentioned here is the portfolio core units, right? With yeah, I think in the next, yeah. So in that level where you have like the counterparties interacting with the portfolio core units to assess and give their recommendations, and then you have like the compliance core unit as the second, I guess. I don't know if you use the term line of defense. And my question was more like, are we also assuming that actually there is an actual prior line of defense than actually the portfolio core units themselves, which is, call it the arranger or all the counterparties actually themselves, which actually understand very well actually the credit risk that they're bringing to the table, and therefore actually do some of the heavy lifting. which then kind of, I think, creates efficiency in the system if they do. But does your framework actually contemplate that first line of defense coming from the intermediary themselves, the pass-through agent, let's say like that?
Yeah, thanks, Will. I mean, absolutely. In the report, as you know, given that you've been a precious contributor in the report, we called the portfolio core unit line of defense as the next line of defense, or the first one of the line of defense within the DAO. But we think that the first line of defense should be outside of the DAO. Because if we go back to the example, of the forward flow approval we did before, we would delegate implicitly the underwriting authority to an external counterparty, because the external counterparty will have a mandate, but then they will be the ones scoring the risk. Now, there is an element of monitoring and shadow rating, let's say, what these guys are doing, but we can discuss this later. But this means that the external counterparty is the first line of defense. So they should be the ones with enough capital to absorb the first hit, and with the power to service the credit that is not performing as expected. So this is the most important line of defense. In our framework, we should hopefully never get to the second line of defense, which is when maker has to take control somehow of the collateral through other parties outside of the DAO, but just be more actively in control, because the first line of defense didn't work. And this goes back to the point I was making with Sebastian, that we should look at liquidation events as black swans, and hopefully the first line of defense, the second line of defense, i.e. the first internal one, never gets implemented. The second one, at the compliance level, is more for operating risk than credit, because the compliance core unit will ensure that what the core units are doing underneath is virtuous and is not malicious. And in credit, unfortunately, we always need to prepare ourselves for the worst possible scenario. We always need to imagine that the world is going to end at some point, and we need to prepare ourselves for it. But I agree with you, just a short version is the first line of defense definitely should be placed outside of the community and at the level of the originator outside. Now, it depends on how the structure it is, and again, this framework is structure agnostic, but it should be outside of the DAO.
Yeah, and a follow-up question that I have now, that kind of like, if we assume that then there's like 3 lines of defense of risk, but there's one, I think, group or network or hub of counterparties, right, that interact with these core units, and then one that kind of like oversees the assessment, or the assessor to the assessees, to the assessors, if you will. Then are we? How do you have like any ideas of how at scale, not thinking the current state, but actually at scale in the future, how that best practice is kind of, I guess, circulate back into those core units? Is that kind of like through the compliance core unit itself, or is there any sort of like mechanism that can implement that actually kind of either, because the compliance core unit essentially will be overseeing things that are happening across a bunch of groups of people working, right? So, and there will be different dynamics that probably will apply across those different core units. So how do you see that, not only kind of like oversight and kind of essentially issuing, as calling there, like a label of compliance certificate, but also I think reinforcing some of the best practices that are learned over time across them. So there is kind of like a sort of feedback loop.
Yeah, I strongly believe in the self-fulfilling power of transparency. I've been an economist and monetary passionate myself all my life. And I think the reason why the central banking model is so powerful, it is because of transparency. And I think the same should be applied here. What I mean in practical terms, it is that if we force all the counterparties to be transparent in the type of structures and the type of setups that they are putting in place, obviously there will have to be somebody that has to sign an NDA and go across the wall to do an underwriting, but it is fine. But if we force the counterparties to be transparent in providing the transparency on the documentation, and if we force the compliance core unit to provide a transparent view about the performance of the underlying portfolio core units, I think this will naturally be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because they will force, on the one hand, counterparties to align to the best practice because they know there is a business opportunity in doing that, and it will force the core units underneath to the core units that do the portfolio management to align to the others, right? And I think it's very clear. And I know that you have the ambition of working in a core unit where you grow leaders that spin off in other core units, and I think this is conducive of that, because you will have a meta layer on top that is ensuring that all the core units underneath, they still have a link between them. But again, the short answer that I give is that I am a strong believer of the power of transparency. So we should try to make this evaluation process as transparent as possible for the people who are interested, because I know these are boring topics. For people who they're not the most excited, for the non-geeks. But I think we should try to make this as transparent as possible.
Excellent. Will, if you have any follow-up?
Yeah, just one last follow-up. I think the thing that we might have to consider, and that's a separate type of discussion on this, the current setup, and I know that it's a principle-based approach, is not supposed to be, I guess, rigid, because there's still discussion to be happening in the community. But I think the current setup we talk a little bit about I think the business side of it, but I think the reality, and I know that there's an understanding for simplicity of the schema. The reality is there's quite a few interactions also with different core units at different touch points in time in the current kind of, if you will, pipeline flow of how credit is underwritten within the DAO. So I know that I have contemplated that in the report, but I think maybe just I think at some point a touch point, and I'm happy to contribute on that, on also the flows from both the non-technical side. So here, kind of, this is more like a business side of the underwriting, but there's also like a technical component to it, which we may have to include at some point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I also think we mentioned this in the report, but we, in the spirit of decentralization and without not replicating most of the skills within the DAO, and I think we haven't touched about the technical side here, but I think there are some technical aspects in the way we structure the collateral, we can access the collateral, and if we are comfortable with the level of decentralization that the external counterparties have in dealing with the collateral, this is something that needs to be addressed. It will need to be addressed also with the help of core units that are outside of this scope of real-world financing. I'm thinking about the collateral engineering core unit and the risk core unit, etc. But I think this is a super important point. That is not proper business underwriting, but is part of the structure. We haven't drawn those boxes here because a lot of other core units should be involved, but that is as important as the type of credit that we are onboarding.
Excellent questions, Will. Peyton submitted a question in chat as well, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, thank you. So my question was about what do we do in the case of novel collaterals? Like, I don't know, say Elon wants to come to us with a twice fired Falcon 9 rocket, right? Are we trying to spin up a real world finance portfolio core unit for every new type? Or are there ways we can kind of streamline that to, not be so reactive as different opportunities become available?
Yeah, no, I think this goes back to the fact that this is a principle-based framework and not a prescriptive framework. So I agree with you, we shouldn't wait to have a core unit set up in a very bureaucratic way to every possible risk, because that would be very inefficient. But I think this framework of having more than one level of controls is conducive of that. What I mean is, if there is genuinely, hopefully, a portfolio core unit that believes to have the right skills that are not necessarily specialized in that risk, but there are some parallelism that can be applied in underwriting that novel risk, that portfolio core unit will step forward and do the work. But then we will have still the second layer of defense, the compliance core unit, that will assess whether the belief of the portfolio core unit of having that required skills actually exists, is genuine or not. And again, the compliance core unit will never step in and say, this is wrong because this should be done in this way, this risk is different in this way. It should just assess the process. So that in my view, the opinion of the compliance core unit would be, we think this process is compliant with the principles, because the portfolio core unit, although it's specialized on risk A, actually there are a lot of parallelisms with risk B, and we believe there is some portability between those two risks. Or no, we think these two risks are very different in nature, and we don't think we have enough skills. Now, obviously, the compliance core unit is not perfect, but I personally think that having a second layer helps. At the end, again, the power of accepting or rejecting is in the hands of the token holders. But that there is a second. I think, again, this second level facilitates the fact that the level underneath is much more fluid. So people are not just waiting to comply specifically to a mandate that is very stringent, because they know that there is a second level that is giving them, this is rubber stamping them or not. I don't know if I answered your question, Pete.
Yeah, Perso said thank you in the chat. Justin is the question holder with the last question in the queue. You have the floor.
Great, thanks. Yeah, thanks for putting this together. It's really interesting. My question is more about, so look, there's been a lot of focus on this about monitoring of risk and understanding the risk in the collateral when we're onboarding. But my question is more about the ongoing monitoring of the loans and what happens in that system. So where I see a weakness in this slight arranger model is that the arranger will be incentivized to continue to keep getting those loans out the door, because once something's been set up and there's a credit line in place, it makes sense for them to keep churning that, because that's how they make money, they make fees, and they take a spread off that. At some point then there needs to be an entity which is monitoring both the arranger and the underlying collateral that we're actually lending against. And I wonder if much thought has been put into how that's resourced and how that's monitored, whether there's a focus on kind of getting some of that data on chain and to get on chain monitoring, or whether that's something we're just going to figure out a bit later.
I can give the first part of the answer. No, the principle based. I think there's two parts, two elements in my answer. The first one is, our view is that the portfolio core unit that was involved in scoring the risk for the onboarding should be the one responsible for the ongoing monitoring of that risk. So they should put together the dashboard and the data requirements that are part of their qualified opinion, and they should monitor the risk on an ongoing basis. And the compliance core unit will evaluate them continuously based on how they're doing the monitoring. how thorough is the monitoring. The second part of the answer, actually, which relates to the first part of your question, is I don't necessarily agree that there is a misalignment of incentive between the arranger and the financier, because it always depends on structuring. I'll make you an example. You have, let's say that you're a bank and you provide lending to a platform that does consumer credit financing. So they're like payday loans, and they churn those loans every 30 days, 20 days, whatever. Now, if they churn the loans, this is actually not bad for you as a lender, because you're saying, okay, you're more liquid, so you can repay me the line. There is a lower risk of coming from illiquidity. And you might even actually negotiate with the platform that you take a portion of those originating fees that those guys like. Because, you said correctly, some of those business models, especially for tiny credit, they make a lot of money on originating fees. Actually, most of the times they make all their money on originating fees, because the rest of the spread just pass it on to the lender. But I think it all goes back to good structuring. That's why I think credit is an art. If you know how to do credit underwriting, then you also know how to align your incentives with the platform. If you don't know you're passive, then you get squeezed. And that's something we don't want to do. But it goes to good structuring. And in terms of monitoring, I think developing best-in-class monitoring dashboard and tools, it will be like heavy lifting job that we need to do, but this will be crucial. Hopefully, my hope is that hopefully this will be as automatized and standardized and brought on chain as possible. But I think it's a process to get there.
Yeah. Okay. And then actually, yes, a slight follow up to that is what are your general thoughts, or the team's general thoughts on moving virtually all of this on chain? I mean, so personally, yeah. I quite like the centrifuge style model of having asset financing actually on chain, but I wonder whether the view is that eventually there'll be billions and billions of DAI going out and that will be all on chain, or whether actually you think it's fine to have the maker ecosystem on chain and then all the financing going off chain quite quickly, or whether you believe that there should actually eventually be full on integration, everything on chain.
Yeah, I think my view, and I'm sure the future will be different, but my view is, so I originally didn't want to call this project RealWorld Sandbox. We called it RealWorld Sandbox because it's an easy term that people are familiar with within the DAO. But I wanted to call it business financing sandbox. Why? Because I think that in the long term, all the business financing will be on chain natively. I think when I talk about business financing, it's any financing need that is a bit more complex than financing on the margin short term versus a token. So if you have any type of financing, even of an on-chain native business that requires certain terms, is structured in a more complex way, etc., I think this framework should apply to any type of financing, and I think this financing will happen mostly on chain in the future. So not only the data, but also the underwriting. I know well the on-chain underwriting model of the Team Lake Pool of Centrifuge. Maybe that, I don't know if that is the model of the future or not, but I really believe that underwriting and monitoring, structuring in the long term will all happen on chain. And the staking of capital at risk across all these levels will actually enforce a lot of the controls that now we have to enforce in a different way. So I think so, but I think we are a few years away. The other important point, and is that also the reason why I think it is so important, I don't want to take too much of your time, guys, but I think it's so important to have this presentation and this fundamental work now, is that I think Maker with real-world financing can be the most powerful ramp into DeFi for institutionals. Like if you are a bank and you have a 10 billion balance sheet that you want to deploy in DeFi, you cannot do it through Circle. You cannot do it through other like stable coins that have massive slippage at that amount. But you can do it through a real-world financing type of setup, where you pledge collateral off-chain that collateral will never go anywhere, but then actually you get minted DAI on chain that not necessarily you want to bring back off chain. You can just keep it on. And I think that's why I think it's very, very important to structure such a solid framework to deal with those counterparties, because I think there is no other DAO out there that can deal with those counterparties in a sophisticated way, as powerful as Maker. That's also why I think it's worth doing a lot of work at the beginning and wasting people's time to set up a very solid framework to do that. Guys, if there are no other questions, I just wanted to conclude with one slide. Just let me do that. So of next steps. So what's going to happen now? So the project, the RealWorld Sandbox project that was backed by SES, will finish with this call and with the report that I will publish on forum after the call is finished. Obviously, the job doesn't finish, but actually starts here. So we wanted to open a consultation phase where people can ask for questions, can review the report, and we can continue this type of conversation, because I think it is so important that we cannot build anything unless we onboard as many people as possible within the community with their opinions. And then our ambition is to make this real, of course. So move to implementation phase. The implementation phase will require certain acts of governance or team building or incubation of potential communities in the future. We don't know how that will work, but I think obviously our ambition is not just to do a report that sits somewhere and gets covered with dust, but actually becomes real. Hopefully we will outline the next steps in the next few weeks, but tomorrow we start a consultation phase to get all your opinion on the report. Then you can contact me, you know my details. I'm on the forum, I'm on Discord, you have my email. So I think there are many ways to contact me in the community. And again, I wanted to thank everybody, guys, for the support. I know that a lot of people have helped me with drafting this report. I try to acknowledge their support on the cover of the report itself. And I'm super enthusiastic to see what comes out of it. So thanks.
This has been great, Luca. It's a shame that you left the vision for the end, but yeah, thanks for the call and your time. It's been great.
Okay.
Yeah, to just echo Juan's point, thank you so much for all the hard work that has gone into it already. We encourage everyone to check out the forum. Luca will be posting the full report here shortly, and in the coming weeks, months, and future, excited to see the work from yourself. So thank you again for everyone for joining the first episode of Maker Explorer, and we'll see you next time.